Hello, everybody. We are so pleased to have this chance to talk with you today. I'm out here on Seal Island with Keenan Yakola, the island supervisor. I think many of you have met Keenan from previous chats, and I like to come out this time of year to see how things are going. And I'm very pleased with everything I'm seeing this year because the island is just thriving with seabirds. Seal Island, just so that most of you um, might know if you haven't been here out this way before, it's a national wildlife refuge that is protected by Audubon and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We work as partners out here. Back in 1984, I had the idea that Seal Island would be a great place to uh, further our efforts to restore seabirds to um, some of their historic nesting colonies, because the island is well known as Maine's largest historical colony of seabirds, particularly of puffins and terns. But by 1969, when I first visited, heard about Seal Island, it had changed dramatically to a largely a gull colony, and the puffins had been gone for almost 100 years. But we are now out here in 2019 and seeing like this could be a snapshot back in time to what this colony looked like in its heyday of the 1850s. It's very satisfying to visit Seal Island these days and see flocks of hundreds of puffins and razorbills, thousands of terns, all streaming into the island with little fish in their beaks to feed their chicks. So we are right at the peak of the nesting season. I would venture to say if a seabird out here hasn't hatched its eggs yet, it's almost getting too late for them, because if they wait too long in the season, then the days get shorter, the water can get warmer, but we're very pleased with how things are going so far. So, Keenan, would you like to say just a few words about what you've seen on the island so far?
Sure. So this year we've been very fortunate to have a good number of birds breeding. We've conducted all of our annual censuses that we do for terns and puffins. We have really good numbers of terns. We have over 2,000 pairs that are nesting. It's a mix of common and Arctic terns, and so far most of those chicks have hatched, and most of the chicks are around 2 weeks old, and we do have some of the oldest chicks are approaching 3 weeks old and are less than a week away from fledging. So soon enough, we'll see young tern chicks flying around, and you might catch a glimpse of them if you look closely on some of the cams. For the puffins, most of the puffin chicks are around 2 weeks old, though we still have some puffin chicks that are just starting to hatch right now. We did our puffin check yesterday, and we had a few chicks that were just about a day old. And our biggest chicks were over 300 grams and nearly 3 weeks old. So we've been doing a lot of work watching our puffins and terns and what they've been bringing in to feed their chicks. So far, we've seen a lot of hake and herring, which are both excellent forage fish that we like to see our chicks being fed. And we've also been doing a lot of band reciting the other day. I don't think I had the chance to mention it to everybody, but I was fortunate enough to see Phoebe feeding a chick, and Phoebe was one of the old puffin cam pairs, feeding a chick just about 4 or 5 feet away from burrow 59, and another burrow 133 that you can see on the exterior puffin burrow cam here on explore.org. So that's just a little bit of what we've been doing, but me and the other interns have been working really hard to just get the best data that we can and follow these birds. And we're really lucky that many of the chicks are surviving and growing really quickly. So we're hoping that will continue.
So let's see. Starting to get a few questions from people. One of the questions I see is about Bucky. I thought I just mentioned a little bit about the background of Bucky's name, because that's significant. Bucky was the name was suggested by Keenan and the team out here in honor of Carl W. Buckheiser. Carl Buckheiser was the president of the National Audubon Society, but the piece of his background that's most important for us is the fact that he was a big fan of seabirds, and he worked out on Matinicus Rock, studied Leach's storm petrels there for many years. He was the first director of the Hog Island Audubon Camp. And when I was a teenager working at the Greenwich Audubon Camp, I met Buck Heister, and he told me stories of these outer islands off the Maine coast that sort of caught my imagination and probably initially planted the seed that led to Project Puffin. So having a puffin named Carl Buckheister is important, I think, and that kind of connection to things. So I'm seeing some questions here about Bucky. There are many mosquitoes in the burrow. Can the puffins be bitten by mosquitoes, and is this a problem for the puffins? It's I don't think it's a big problem. They could be bitten, and the mosquitoes can bite any warm-blooded animal, and that's probably what they do when we're not out here to feed them ourselves. But I don't think there's a significant number of mosquitoes, and it's probably just part of the life in the burrow. Over the years, I have watched the interactions of puffin chicks with invertebrates in the burrows, and I've always been kind of intrigued by this relationship. Some of the early hunting behaviors that seabirds face probably may exercise them first with the little camel crickets and other invertebrates, ants, and things that they encounter in the burrow. I've seen them chase and even snap up and consume a few little invertebrates inside the burrows. Never seen them eat a mosquito, but not a bad idea. If they would start that up, we'd all appreciate it. So let's see what else. Is Bucky larger than average for his age? Keenan, you just measured Bucky. Do you want to talk about Bucky's condition?
Yep, sure. So we took Bucky out for a checkup yesterday. We're hoping to do that every 5 days, and it's a really nice opportunity to follow this chick because we have the live cam on there, and we have a good idea of how often Bucky is being fed and what prey items Bucky is being fed. So it gives us a really interesting way to look at how the prey items and how much they're being fed may influence Bucky's development into becoming a fledgling puffin. So yesterday when we took Bucky out, he had a wing of 62 millimeters and his mass was 164 grams. That's pretty average for a puffin chick about that age, maybe a little heavier than normal, but certainly within 5 or 10 grams of the average and comparable to many of the chicks surrounding Bucky. Bucky is one of only hundreds of chicks that are currently on Seal Island, and we measure quite a few of them when we do our 5-day checkups. So we'll continue to check up on Bucky, and we're hoping that he'll get well over 100 grams before he fledges, and if we're really lucky, over grams is what we'd really like to see just before he fledges. So we'll continue to update you guys every 5 days, and if you keep an eye on the exterior puffin burrow cam, you might get a chance to see Bucky outside of the burrow. And you can really compare him to my hands when I'm measuring him to see how much he's grown. And we'll keep an eye on him. He's going to start dropping some of that down and start growing in some of his real feathers as he prepares to fledge. And he'll probably start flapping a bit more soon and preparing for the exiting of the burrow and the fledging, which is only a few weeks away.
Following up on the invertebrate discussion, I've also seen, watching the cams, and many of you have probably seen these little flat-bodied invertebrates. They're isopods, sometimes called roly-polies, although this one I don't think actually rolls up into a ball. But these serve a function inside the burrow as well. They actually consume some of the excrement that accumulates in the burrow, and they probably help to maintain the interior of the burrow and keep the burrow clean, which is important so that the puffin chick doesn't get its feathers fouled in its excrement. You probably also notice that that there's a sort of a toilet area in the burrow. That's something to watch for as the chick gets older. All the excrement is kept in one spot in the back of the burrow where the chick is small and not too agile. As it gets older and the excrement increases, they move their toilet area to the mouth of the burrow and start shooting outwards. But they only do that when they're quick enough to dash back in, so they have to be very mobile to stay away from predators lurking outside. I see another question here. what are your thoughts on Willie taking a new partner this year? Yeah, Keenan and I were both very surprised when that happened because, as you remember, Willie and his mate from last couple of years, Billy, we expected them to both, if they survived, to both return. To find that Willie returned and Billy didn't return at first surprises. I think that Ken, you have seen Billy nearby. Is that right?
Yeah, we've seen Billy a number of times, relatively close to burrow 59. And I've been keeping an eye out for her, and I've been hoping that maybe she's breeding with another mate this year, but we're going to keep looking, and hopefully someday we'll see her bringing in fish to a different burrow. But it certainly was surprising.
Yeah, so we don't have any proof of what the reasons for that. I mean, we think of puffins as typically keeping the same mate from year after year. They have a reputation of being one of the most monogamous of birds, and we've seen elsewhere, especially at Eastern Egg Rock, where there's a small colony, that they can keep the same mate for a decade or more. So this did surprise us. I wonder whether the habitat type here lends itself more to breakup of pairs, because the habitats of these round boulders might move around, might change the appearance. I don't know. Another interesting thing I've been thinking about lately was maybe last summer we saw a lot of prospectors poking their heads into the burrows, including this burrow. In fact, some of you will recall the attacks we saw on little puffling Grace last year. And those attacks are associated with other puffins taking up presence. It's possible that the new mate was one of those prospectors last year who took a liking to this burrow and returned there before Billy made it back. Maybe Willie and Millie found each other at the burrow ahead of the time, and Billy then was late to arrive for whatever reasons, and had to move elsewhere. So these are all speculations, but they're interesting ones that relate to some of the things we're seeing. We noticed last year more attacks than usual because of, we suspect because of the warm water and that we had last year, and the puffins were feeding far from the island, leaving their burrow, both of them, and leaving little puffling Grace alone in the burrow, vulnerable to prospectors like this. So it's possible that this change of guard here has something to do with last year's feeding conditions and prospecting conditions. Burrow guarding. One of the reasons the adults stay in the burrow, in addition to tending the chick, is to guard the burrow from prospectors like this. These kinds of subtle behavioral effects of climate change are an interesting thing to think about, because if the water is warming and the puffins are not in the burrow and they're far at sea, this gives opportunities then for more prospectors, and maybe this affects mate stability in the future. All speculation, but fun to think about. Other questions here? Any sightings of Pow or Joy? I'll turn that one to Keenan.
So unfortunately, there's been no sightings of Joy yet this year. We are keeping an eye out. We always are. We're very hopeful that she'll return. However, we have seen Pow multiple times. He really likes to hang out on the boulder berm. You probably see him most days, but it's just too difficult to read the band number from the cams. But every time I go out to that boulder berm, we do see Pow. I've been hoping to see him carrying fish, but have not so far. And his behavior, loafing with other puffins and doing a lot of head tossing and other displays to other puffins, suggests that he might not be breeding yet. He just spends a lot of time loafing. So I think maybe next year might be his first year breeding. But we are keeping an eye out and watching him whenever we go out there. So keep an eye out. If you get a good look and he comes close enough to one of the cams, you might be able to read his band number, FH70. So keep an eye out.
So there's a question. We've been listening to newborn pufflings this week. Do we have chicks nearby? There are chicks nearby. I can't speak to those particular burrows mentioned. Keenan, do you want to mention 778 and 789?
Yeah, so 778, I know that we have a chicken. I've seen multiple feedings to that burrow so far this year. And 789, we believe, has a chick as well. It's right next door to burrow 59. So there's chicks really all around them, just tons of them. On that boulder berm, I would estimate that there's at least 50 to 100 chicks, if not maybe more. Their puffins are very densely packed in that area. And you see a lot of the puffins there on the boulder berm. And that's one of the reasons that we put the camera there in the first place, because there's so many puffins that are nesting in that one densely packed area.
And someone has asked if it's normal for a chick like Bucky to be left alone. Yes, the chicks can handle this just fine. I mean, they when we translocated the puffin chicks to Seal Island originally, and remember, this is a restored colony. We moved about 1,000 puffin chicks here between 1984 and 1989. We were hand rearing 200 puffin chicks at a time. They were alone in the burrows, and they can handle the temperature changes and such by themselves. In a natural situation, we're still learning about this, and I think that's one of the fascinating things about the cams is we're learning that puffins they're in the burrows much more than we ever thought, but exactly when they're gone or not. And this idea that they're away to go feed more is also something we're testing. We're putting this year on Matinicus Rock, we're putting some GPS tags on puffins that will tell us more about where they go to feed. We don't even know how far puffins from our main colonies go to feed. And I think that probably is related to the availability of the fish. I mean, they may fly a long distance even when the fish are super abundant, because it makes sense to go to where you know the fish are rather than looking close and maybe not finding them. So probably my hunch is they would take a longer trip if they're sure that they were going to find food there. That's something. These are the kind of decisions that seabirds have to make all the time, is whether they look for food nearby or whether they go a long trip and where they're sure they're going to find things. And where they've fed before is probably a good place to look for them in the future, because birds have amazing memories. They can find their way around and they can remember places. When you think about it, the ocean looks so uniform to our eyes. The fact that they could fly off and go to the same spot in the ocean, often far from land, and return to the same spot, it's just amazing. But then that's what they do, and that's their home. So are you still being... So there's a question about butterfish. They've been pretty rare this year, and I'm going to let Keenan speak to the kinds of fish that we have been seeing, because this is a very important topic.
So this year for puffins, we've been seeing, the season started out the first couple weeks of us watching the puffin diet. So the end of June into just the beginning of July. The diet comprised mostly of hake, which isn't a bad prey item. It's a good one, especially when there's enough of them and they're big enough. And slowly the diet's been starting to change. And this is pretty typical of most seasons. Within the season, the diet tends to shift. It's not consistent over the entirety of the season. And it can change on a dime. One day you could have all hake and the next day it could be all herring. But this year we started off with a lot of hake, especially in the first 2 weeks. And slowly we've been switching over to a diet that comprises a pretty even mix of hake, herring, and haddock. Last year we had quite a while where the diet was almost entirely haddock, and most of them were larval, not fully developed haddock, very young, and likely are not as energetically high in lipids for these puffins, which is really what we want them to eat to build up their fat content. But this year there's been plenty of herring and plenty of hake and herring, haddock. So that's good so far. We're hoping that the puffins can maintain high feeding rates and keep bringing in these prey items while they raise their chicks. Our concern would be if their feeding rates especially drop, and if their diet starts to switch over to more butterfish. But like Steve said, we've been fortunate this year, and the butterfish have been relatively rare.
So one of the ways we follow this is to plan a day where we go out into one of the observation blinds, these 3-foot square plywood structures out in the colony, and we take turns sitting in the blind for 2 to 3 hours at a time. And we go out there in the very earliest light. This morning's stint started about 4:30 in the morning, when we have enough light to find our way safely out to the blinds. And we'll be out there until after 8 o'clock tonight, watching a certain set of burrows and counting every feeding in those burrows. If we're seeing 5 to 7 feedings a day, that's pretty normal, particularly if they're nice sized beak loads. A nice sized beak load would be a 5 or 6 fish in a beak load, and if the fish are about the length of the beak, that makes for a good meal. And the chicks will grow on that. This time of year, we should expect to see the feeding rate increase, and maybe the size of the fish will increase because the fish are getting older in the waters around the island. And if things really pick up, we may see 15 to 20 feedings for some nests if the food is abundant and near the colony. So far, we're not seeing that, but I think we're satisfied to see what we are seeing so far. These kinds of fish are very important, and the herring is of significance because herring has been very scarce in the puffin's diet here at Seal Island in recent years. And as Keenan points out, it's high in fat and it's just the right size. It's also a little thicker than is a hake and a little broader. So a herring and a hake of the same length are actually the herring's a better meal because there's more bulk to it, more mass to it. And we're pleased too that this past year there's been some changes in the fishing regulations. An important one was to keep the bigger midwater trawls, these fishing boats that can take enormous amounts of fish out of the ocean, mostly for lobster bait, and they've now fished further from the coast. So the puffins, which we don't know where the puffins go exactly, but we're hoping that these big fishing fleets are moved further away and let the coastal wildlife have more to eat. So there's a question. Puffin beaks are really colorful. Are they that colorful for any specific reasons? That's sort of like the question: why does the peacock have such a incredibly, ridiculously big tail? None of the other seabirds in the Gulf of Maine have beaks like that. Why does the puffin have this beak? So there's several probably answers. In most questions about nature, I think it's overly simplified. I think there is an answer. It's usually many things that drive the way animals look. So one of the things is that puffins, when they're young, don't have a colorful beak like that. They only get it when they're 2 years old, and they don't breed until they're 5 years old. So why would they get a colorful beak when they're 2 and they don't breed till 5? Well, we think that they are looking for mates and pairing up actually a year or 2 before they actually lay their first egg. That's part of the reason. Beak probably is related to mate selection. When both male and female have the same colors, it suggests that it's important to both the males and the females to have these bright colors or ornaments. So the bright color is probably a measure, a badge for age and for perhaps health. It's been determined recently that it can be seen in bright colors in ultraviolet light, so it reflects ultraviolet light. So seabirds can see in the ultraviolet spectrum that like many other kinds of birds. So it may also suggest gender. And another thing is that it could just be partly, one of the answers to that is that birds just like it. It's beautiful to look at. And they may select their mate because of the mate has the bigger, brighter, colorful, glowing in ultraviolet light type beak. And both males and females probably see beauty in the other bird's beak. I kind of think that's probably part of it. Millie seems to have, there's a question above that number. Is climate change rapidly changing the landscape of seabirds? The answer to that one is yes. Climate change probably is the biggest thing affecting seabirds worldwide. And it affects them in many ways. Just a few of those ways are that climate, as warm water does not hold as much oxygen, and therefore there's going to be fewer prey, little plankton able to survive in warmer water. Climate change is also the temperature affects the kinds of plankton, and the timing of the plankton. In Maine, the Gulf of Maine, which is warming faster than almost any other body of water in the oceans of the world, we're seeing that the phytoplankton, the little tiny plants, are blooming. That is, they are appearing in the spring about 2 weeks earlier than they used to just a decade ago. And the zooplankton, which then feeds on the phytoplankton, is not correspondingly earlier. And so there's a disjunct between the timing of the phytoplankton and the timing of the blooming of the zooplankton. Not a good thing. It means there's less zooplankton, not as much for it to eat. And the kinds of zooplankton is also changing, especially the copepods. The highly nutritious, fat-carrying copepods are not as abundant as they used to be here in this part of the Gulf. It's causing some animals like the right whales to shift their whole range further north. And small fish are affected by this as well, finding less to eat and moving deeper in the ocean column, often so deep that puffins, we think, can't easily dive down to find them, or they have to swim further out to find these fish in the colder water. So these are some of the food chain effects. Then there's ocean level rise. The ocean is expanding and rising and flooding habitat that it didn't used to. And here on Seal Island, that's a big issue because many of the puffins are nesting quite low near the ocean. And a big wave on top of an already rising storm, one big wave could wipe out many low nesting puffins and razorbills. There's also a pattern of more rainfall in the Northeast as a result of our warming climate, and stronger winds and more tropical storms and hurricanes. We hear about all these things on the public news, but connecting those to seabirds isn't always made. But here on the islands, we can see these changes affecting the seabirds. And we know now that the growth of the chick is closely related to all these factors. If the chicks are doing well, it means the whole ecosystem is doing well. This is why the NOAA has this year put seabirds into it as an indicator of the health of the ecosystem. And that is a good thing because it points out how important seabirds are to telling people that the oceans are changing. People are causing those changes. And if we look after the seabirds, we're helping also look after the oceans. A long answer to a very important question, but thank you for asking that question. I'm going to move on down this list here. Millie seems to have recovered quickly from her foot injury. Great news. But she has lost the webbing on the right foot. Do you think something attacked her foot while she was fishing? Keenan, would you like to comment on that one?
Yeah, so I think that it's really difficult to figure out what exactly happened to her. For whatever reason, puffins losing the webbing in between their toes is a relatively common injury. You see it quite frequently. If you were to come out to Seal Island and you were to look out through all the loafing puffins on the rocks, you'd notice quite a few of those puffins were missing the webbing. And this could happen for a variety of reasons. It could another puffin could attack them. They could get their foot caught on a structure like some sort of rock or a sharp edge. It's very difficult to know exactly what happened. But it shouldn't affect her too much as long as she continues this good recovery, and she should be able to fish and still catch food for little Bucky, which seems to be the case so far. So we'll continue to keep an eye on her, but I'm not too worried about her, and hopefully she'll be just fine.
And don't you have a puffin nesting nearby that's missing its full leg and foot? And it's kind of informs us about what's possible. I mean, and I hear that one-legged puffin is raising a chick this year and has raised chicks in other years, and the chick is growing well.
Yeah, I think many of you have taken pictures of our one-legged puffin that we have on the boulder berm and shared them with us. And it's really cool that one of the burrows that we monitor for our productivity and the measuring of the chicks, just like we do with Bucky, is the offspring of that one-legged puffin, and they continue to raise a chick in that burrow every single year, despite having just one leg. So it's pretty amazing what lengths these puffins can go to, even when they're a little bit debilitated with just one leg.
So another question: are puffins and penguins in the same family? You know, they look similar, but they're actually very distantly related. The reason they look similar is thought to be an example of convergent evolution, where they live in the same ocean kinds of habitat, and they find food in similar ways. But if you look at the taxonomy, it turns out that penguins are more closely related to albatrosses and petrels. Long ago, they diverged, and puffins and other members of the auk family are related more closely to gulls and terns. Long ago, but they both live in cold water. They both discovered ways to find fish by diving and by using their wings underwater. So there are lots of people ask that question, but it's a question of the habitat shaping the animals to look the way they do. Someone asked about banded puffins. How many or what percentage of returning puffins are already banded? You know, in the early years of this project, they were almost all banded because they came from our Newfoundland translocated birds. But even in the beginning, we were seeing some birds without bands. Then it might be just 1 out of 10. Those were probably wild birds being attracted by the translocated puffins. But these days, the majority of them are unbanded. Wouldn't you say that's the case, Keenan?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But we still band as many of the chicks as we can, because their survival from year to year tells us about how the oceans are doing. If a year's cohort, that is an age class of birds produced this year, doesn't come back and it's a warm summer, that tells us something about the importance of ocean conditions and supports what we know. And we do see a trend, a long-term trend in lower return rates. Even though the colony itself is growing, the rate of return each year seems to be less likely to be as great as previous years. That probably has something to do with the condition of the chicks at fledging too, because chicks that leave here lightweight are less likely to survive because the parents are not taking care of them after they leave the island. That's just the puffin's way. They're back in the burrow, guarding the burrow or looking after their own well-being, because puffins live a long time and they don't need to assure every year to be successful. Their best approach is to do a good job with that single chick, send it off to sea with its backpack, if you will, well stashed with fat supplies to feed the chick. Well, it learns to survive on its own. So let's see. Here's another question. Will this year's chicks return to Seal Island next year? How old are puffins when they begin to breed? So this year's chicks will likely not come back next year. When they're 2 years old, they may make their first landfall. You can watch for the 2-year-old chicks. They're easy to recognize after you watch in 2 ways. First of all, their beak is smaller. it tends to be a little more triangular. It doesn't have the sort of arched upper part to the beak, the upper mandible. There's no ridges on the orange part, very smooth. And the other thing about a newcomer, a bird that spent 2 years paddling on the ocean and never stepping foot on land, is that it is very curious and very active. Usually they're working around the edges of clusters of puffins, and they're poking at rocks a lot. If there's a decoy, they'll be especially interested in the decoys. We see those little 2-year-olds very active, interesting birds. So watch for them. That's a fun thing to look for on the loafing ledge, especially this time of year. Okay. Well, this year's chicks, we read that one. When puffins are out to sea for 9 months of a year, how do they sleep and rest? Well, I'll take that one too, because that's one of the most amazing things about a ocean-going or pelagic bird, is that they are probably more at home, or at least as at home at sea as they are on land. They just float on the water. Remember that they are perfectly waterproofed. They can drink salt water and excrete the salty brine out of their nostrils. They can sleep on the water, but birds don't sleep like we do, or where they're totally in dreamland. They're always sort of, half of their brain is resting and the other half is awake, and they're sort of looking out of the eye that is on the side that's still active. But yes, they are well adapted to living at sea, and all they have to do to find food is to sort of dive under the water and start looking. I don't know. Is there any other questions? Maybe we've reached a list of the questions here. A question that I often get from people is, what can I do to help puffins? Somebody from Colorado asked me that question recently, a landlocked state. And I said, I live in the mountains. What can I do to help puffins? And I was reflected just how connected even people from landlocked states are to puffins, because the whole world is connected, and especially when we start thinking about climate change, our effects are huge. Reducing our carbon footprint, both at home and at work, is so important to trying to slow the rate of climate change. Voting for policymakers that understand climate change is very important, because at the national level and at our state levels, there are a lot of opportunities to pass legislation that recognizes the importance of climate change. That helps puffins. It's all connected. Those little puffin chicks that are gagging on oversized fish that the parents bring back are reminders that puffins are affected by climate, and we are all part of that climate effect. Another thing that people can do is to reduce their use of one-use plastics. Declining something like a soda straw at a restaurant may seem like a small item, but it's a beginning, and it's a conversation starter to show how much we can affect the production of plastics in this world, most of which end up in our oceans, none of which ever disappear. They just get smaller and smaller. This morning, I went for a walk here on Seal Island. I came back with a huge garbage bag full of plastic that just washed up way out here, 20 miles out to sea. It just kept washing up, and I know there's more behind it, but it was a reminder to me how much there is. And among those were a couple of plastic balloons that washed up from somebody's birthday party, and one was a 4th of July celebration not far away, which still had helium in it. That one could have been launched from Colorado and got in the wind stream and floated all the way to the East Coast. I would not be surprised, because the airflow moves from west to east here off the coast of Maine. And those things entangle wildlife, like puffins. I found them inside of puffin burrows, those balloons. So that's one thing we can do. Supporting conservation is the other thing. We can we can all make a difference by contributing to projects. Project Puffin depends completely on private donations to support our work, to support our interns like Keenan and our other 30 young conservation biologists on the islands. So supporting Project Puffin, you can do it online. It's very easy. It all helps keep the puffins protected and helps continue our ongoing work, learning how to keep their world safe. Let's see that. I think I see some more questions just popped up. Okay, I think that is actually our last question. So I'm glad we're able to end it on a conservation note. I hope you all enjoy watching the puffin cams. I want to thank Explore.org and the Annenberg Foundation for making this program of sharing our puffin cams with the world important. We're making friends for seabirds every day. Please have those conversations with your friends about what they can do to help seabirds, because we can all make a difference. And a big part of that is sharing their world and sharing these cams with other people. So thank you very much. It's been fun talking to everyone from Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge.
Thank you.